in China because it's just a much more techno-optimist society. And at WAIC, I saw tons of children from the very young, like, maybe 5 years old, to probably teenagers who were in like large group tours, or many of them were with their parents. The conference, by the way, for those of you who haven't gone, first of all, is huge. I think something like 300,000 people attended this year or something, and it was massively sold out. Yeah, we had a really good geographic diversity in the group. We did have a lot of people from India. We had a few folk from Silicon Valley and other parts of America, and 2 from Europe. Oh, no, 3 from Europe. So it was really interesting to see everyone's different reactions.
Welcome to Inside the China Room. This podcast is recorded in China and features interviews with experts from various trending sectors. If you enjoy this episode, be sure to subscribe. This summer, the global AI community looked to Shanghai. The 2025 World Artificial Intelligence Conference, WAIC, buzzed with product launches, live demos, and bold talks about the future of intelligence. Since China's DeepSeek moment earlier this year, international curiosity has kept growing. What is really unfolding in China's AI scene, and how does it differ from the US approach? To help us answer those questions, I'm joined today by Rui Ma, founder of TechBuzz China. She has nearly 20 years in tech and finance in both the US and China. She is now based in Silicon Valley. Rui just completed a packed trip across China at the end of July. She guided AI investors and founders from Silicon Valley, India, and Europe to WAIC and to visits with Tencent, Alibaba Cloud, Baidu, Minimax, SenseTime, Zhihu, and more. She also met top AI-focused VCs in China, such as Yunqi Partners and Linear Capital, for a close look at China's startup scene. Hi, Ray. Welcome to Inside the China Room.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me.
I have to tell you that when I launched this show in 2022, your name was on my guest wish list. Actually, at that moment, you already hosted the hugely popular TechBuzz China podcast, so it's a real privilege to chat with you today.
Thank you.
Actually, I heard many comments on internet hoping to listen to your podcast. I know that you are occupied by some other things, but I mean, you have lots of fans. So I actually think you don't need a long intro. Many overseas China watchers know your work, but for anyone new, could you share what you have been doing recently, especially what motivated you to bring a delegation to WAIC this year? Have you organized similar trips before? And is it because there was a moment that you felt China's AI scene needed a closer in-person look?
Yeah, so good question. Been obviously running TechBuzz China since 2018 and sort of expanded over the years beyond the podcast, which now no longer runs, into bespoke research and also investor trips. So this is not, in fact, the first trip that we've run to bring investors and founders to China. This is more like the 6th or 7th. The first one was actually pre-pandemic in 2019, focused on internet. But after the pandemic, we've been running trips focused on EV, electric vehicles. And this is the first one on AI. I would say that the interest in the AI trip, it's a lot of personal interest, to be honest. So, aside from doing TechBuzz China, I'm a person who wears many hats. I've been working at an AI startup, working focused on enterprise workflows, and that's since 2 years ago. My role in the company has transitioned over time, but basically, I've been really deep in the depths of AI, especially as it comes to commercialization. I think that for China AI, I've always been interested because I run TechBuzz. I've always been talking to Chinese investors, founders, a lot of them actually when they come to Silicon Valley, because so many of them do come and visit. I would say that I got the idea that I could probably get a group together after DeepSeek, though. And when I saw that DeepSeek, which was known, by the way, to me much earlier before it blew up in the public consciousness, after I saw how many people were interested, I was like, oh, hey, maybe I could put together a trip and visit many of these, amazing AI startups I've heard of. But, as an individual investor, as an individual, it's a little difficult to get in-depth meetings with some of these companies. So I thought I'd bring a group, and it really worked out really well. We got a lot of interest And I think our final tally was 23 people. Our target was 25. We actually did reach 25. There were a few people that got their visa denied for administrative reasons. And yeah, it was an amazing packed trip.
Even I'm based in China, I'm also, if I have a chance, I also want to join your trip. And based your experience this time, after visiting WIC and touring companies like Tencent, Alibaba Cloud, and Minimax, what would you most want your peers in the US or Europe, or maybe any other parts of the world to know that they probably have missed? You just mentioned your group was about just 20, more than 20 people, right?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, we had a really good geographic diversity in the group. We did have a lot of people from India, which I think many of your listeners might find interesting or surprising. But yeah, a lot of Indians I know actually throughout the last 15 years have been highly interested in the Chinese tech ecosystem. We had a few folk from Silicon Valley and other parts of America, and I think two from Europe. Oh, no, three from Europe. So it was really interesting to see everyone's different reactions. Some of the highlights I'll share that I think stood out the most are I think the first one, which I've tweeted a lot about, is that in China, AI is not really separate from robotics. It's just one whole thing where you have embodied intelligence, right? People are using that word a lot in China, but it is very much falling sort of under the general umbrella of AI. And I would say at the World AI Conference, the whole second floor was pretty much devoted to devices and robotics. So there were some glasses, but overwhelmingly they were just like robot dogs and humanoid robots like basically running amok. So it was quite a sight. And, I think another thing that stood out is just how cheap, like, all the solutions are and how focused on cost. This doesn't come as a surprise to me necessarily, but it's just an economic reality, right? That Chinese users and Chinese companies are just very price sensitive. Sometimes it is the lack of ability to pay, and sometimes it's just unwillingness to pay. This results in that Chinese companies in the AI space are very, very hyper focused on cost. I would say, in fact, that I rarely met a company, and I actually can't think of an example of a company that's, when benchmarking their product against a Western peer exceeded like 30% of the cost. So the
Wow.
discounts were significant. Yeah, granted, some of the companies we met with were like kind of on infrastructure levels, so they have different economics behind it. But yeah, a lot of them, if they were selling to rest of world customers, not US based, they were really, really focused on cost. Obviously, everyone was doing a lot of open source. Another thing was how much many of the entrepreneurs were looking at AI products differently from here in Silicon Valley, where people are still it's still very much like a software only mentality. Whereas two of the most popular companies that we met with on the trip by just interest from the group, one was a smart device company that was using basically a smart name badge to help you capture offline conversations, the sales insights, and help sales teams really become much more effective at dealing with customers. And that's really taking advantage of China's like hardware manufacturing ability, right? And the other one was a um, Hangzhou based software company, but they were like trying to they're already working with brands and generating a lot of AI digital assets, but now they were going deeper into the supply chain, going straight to manufacturers and using a lot of the technology they developed to get a cut of the actual products being produced. So using AI to inform the actual makers of these products what to make and basically closing the loop so that there's more of a match between what users want and what actually ends up being made. So taking advantage of China's supply chain. So these are much more unique, sort of China specific models that you see. And a lot of it is because, yes, the supply chain is much more advanced, but it's also because, yeah, people are not willing to pay for pure services or software, right? It's much easier to make a cut of a completed transaction instead.
Yeah, you mentioned about the robots. It reminds me of the annual performance on the national television every year, like 春节联欢晚会, that we have like robots showing to not just like for professional people, but for the general public, national public. So I think the government is also like to promote such type of things to let people know that the progress of AI is in China. And about the software, the app stuff you mentioned in Silicon Valley, I also read articles that it seems that it's very popular in United States that people are designing software apps. Not that much on hardware. I don't know if that's still the situation now, but I can feel that there is some differences between the AI ecosystem. We'll touch on that a little bit later. But how did your delegation react to the companies and technologies they saw in China? Any wow moments or cultural fictions according to your observation? You mentioned your groups has like people from India and from Europe and from the United States.
Well, actually, everything was very smooth. I didn't find any there were, like, no culturally awkward moments, except for one moment where, some of the attendees who were practicing vegans were a little shocked by some of the foods that were non-vegan that were served in some of the meals, but, we had them seated at a separate table. So, that was probably the only thing that came up that was a little bit uncomfortable. Everything else was great. I think everyone was very positive, really liked the infrastructure, really liked just the state of the cities. We went to we actually, I joked about this, but we took everyone to, Nanjing East Road, which is the sort of most famous shopping street in Shanghai, intending to walk them to the Bund for a welcome dinner, post-dinner walk, and we lost a lot of them at the Pop Mart flagship store. So, yeah, so the shopping was also, really spectacular. I think in terms of what stood out, there there were a couple of meetings where we asked about power, right? The availability of power when it comes to AI, which is a big topic in the US. So, quite a few of the attendees were interested in learning more about how China was resolving this problem. And, I have been following power pretty closely, and I knew that this was probably not a problem in China, but I think it was surprising to some of the attendees that so many of the responses were very much very confident that, oh, power is a solved issue in China. And they were all talking about, by the way, sustainable power, right? So the AI data centers are going to be powered a lot by hydro and nuclear power because, by the way, the government subsidizes this. So it's actually cheaper. It is obviously sustainable and it is very reliable, and the build out is just very quick. So for the US, where there's a lot of debate about, what to do as AI is a very power hungry industry, that was one thing that stood out that China, at least the people we spoke to, consider it largely a solved problem.
And from your perspective, let's talk about more about like the differences between the U.S. and China. I think you mentioned about the infrastructure, like the power generations, and you all mentioned about like the software versus hardware. Do you agree with the notion that China tends to focus more on commercial delivery and less on frontier research? If there is such difference, is that gap narrowing or like widening?
I think looking backwards, that might be a conclusion that is more valid than it is today. I do think there is very much a sense of we want to be cutting edge, no matter the size of the company. Obviously, the very large companies are extremely vested in, producing like the most leading research. But even I think the small companies are increasingly more interested in that. I think when it comes to AI, the nice convergence that you see is that with AI, the moat, like, actually oftentimes comes from we spoke to one foundational model company in China, and they were very unapologetic about or they were I should say they were very proud of the fact that they feel like in the world of AI, the moat is the technology, right? So it is the quality of the model. It is not about your go-to-market strategy. It is not as much really about your interface, right? There are, like, far fewer effects of network effects and all these things. It's really just about the quality of your model, how fast is it, how cheap is it, and how quickly you're iterating. So for AI, I think That was also another surprising thing. Number 1, they're very heavy on R&D for most of the companies we visited, but the headcounts were also really lean. I'm used to when I worked in China from 2007 to 2015, I'm used to, like, seeing headcounts from the mobile internet era in China where, it's easily companies have a couple hundred or thousands of employees. But most of the companies we met with were 100 or so. A few were a couple hundred. None were in the 4 digits. And when we asked them about their headcount, none of them were planning to expand aggressively. And a few of them said that it was because they found that they could be highly productive using AI in their own development, in their own R&D efforts. So I think that was also something that was surprising. You see that in Silicon Valley a lot as well. But, you know, I guess I didn't necessarily expect it to be such discipline in terms of headcount in China as well.
Let's talk about headcounts. I mean, I think the many of the first generation of the founders of tech companies in China, they have education experience in the United States. I don't know if you talk about like the background of these the employees you just mentioned and the capabilities of the talents in the nowadays Chinese AI companies. How would you describe the features of those people or their capabilities or background?
Yeah, I think that DeepSeek showed that you don't have to be a graduate of a foreign university to be doing amazing innovation in AI. Overall, I think the talent in China is very deep when it comes to just all software development and AI, especially because it is so math focused of a subject. I think that for most of the companies we visited, which were I guess a few of them were focusing on international markets, but probably at least half were looking at internal Chinese markets. So they weren't necessarily trying to get international talent at all. My understanding is that salaries are still pretty reasonable, or I may be using a Silicon Valley lens because it is quite crazy here. So, yeah, overall, the cost effectiveness of talent in China is very high. Being at an AI startup, the most important thing you're looking for is someone's ability to learn quickly because so many of these things are completely new, right? So very few people have years and years of, experience using AI in a development setting because this technology is new. And most companies aren't trying to do, foundational model research, right? Most companies are on the application level. So in terms of talent, China has definitely a sufficient number. And as long as there is, I think, a market, all these companies will grow quite well.
And what about fundraising? I mean, you are an investor and you also visited some AI focused VCs this time. Did you see any like differences between like the process of fundraising for AI companies in China and in the United States? We know that actually in the past 5 years, the VC sectors in China actually experienced some challenges and I mean the transition moment. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I'm not as actively investing and now actually have been on a pretty long pause since 2023. But what I would say is that I interact with a lot of Chinese VCs and it really depends on their strategy. It depends on what they're investing in and ultimately like where their sources of funding come from. It's it was definitely very dire. The situation was very dire last year. I think it's slightly warmed up a little bit more in terms of USD fundraising. That being said, a lot of the fundraisings I don't think are coming from US institutions like they were 10 years ago. They're coming from other sources of people who have USD, some of whom are just like Chinese nationals, right, that have exited on the US capital markets. I think that for the VC space, what the government is doing, trying to warm up the capital markets for some of these new innovative companies is helping people be a little bit more confident that they, don't have to rely on just the US capital markets for exits, that they could look to Hong Kong, for example, but it'll still take some time. It'll still take some time. A lot of the LPs, limited partners that invest into Chinese VC funds still have, I think, like a far less risk tolerance than US institutions. So then that will limit the risk appetite of the investor, and that will limit what kind of companies end up getting investment. So all that has like a whole ripple effect. That being said, I think there's plenty of activity. There is definitely a group of companies that want to, like Manus, have started in China, but want to basically move their operations overseas or raise money overseas or primarily serve a overseas market. But there are lots of other companies that are kind of staying put, still remaining headquartered in China or Asia, and then still going to service the Chinese market and therefore raise money from Chinese or Chinese affiliated capital.
Yeah, I think you can see many documents or policies from the government that emphasize the importance of investing in AI sector. It is a trend, yeah. And you shared something on Xiaohongshu that kids in China can literally touch AI. Could you share what you mean by that, especially what you saw at WAIC? You are a self-described Silicon AI mom. I think your Xiaohongshu's Chinese name, Chinese account is called 硅谷 AI Mama. So
Yeah.
if any of our followers, I mean, we have some listeners are based in China, you can also follow Rui Ma's Xiaohongshu account. So how would you compare the AI learning environments between kids in China and US?
Yeah, look, I live in Silicon Valley, so there's a certain group of parents like myself who are very interested in introducing AI to our kids early on, especially in the context of helping them acquire knowledge. So in education itself. That being said, I think the sentiment overall relative to China is much more suspicious of technology, especially AI here. I think like a lot of people, for example, on mommy forums I'm in or whatever, will say that they feel guilty that they work for a company that might be creating AI that might take away certain other people's jobs. I
Oh,
don't really see
maybe
that.
their children's future job?
Or like current,
Yeah.
people's jobs, other people's jobs currently. But
Okay.
I I think that kind of discussion is far less in China because it's just a much more techno optimist society. And at WAIC, I saw tons of children from the very young, like, maybe 5 years old to probably teenagers who were in like large group tours or many of them were with their parents, and it just seemed like it was just like a weekend activity for them. The conference, by the way, for those of you who haven't gone, first of all, is huge. I think something like 300,000 people attended this year or something, and it was massively sold out. But it's like a trade show, right? It's not really like a entertainment event. So I was genuinely surprised to see so many children there. And then even when we went to Baidu Apollo Park to test out their autonomous vehicles, right before us, I think was a pretty large group of middle schoolers. So yeah, I was a little surprised because that just doesn't happen as much in the U.S. And you can see through government policy there is this push to insert AI curriculum into like all elementary school students, lessons, plans, etc. That's what I meant by you could sort of touch AI because it's just, so much more front and center. There are all these like retail shops that are popping up, selling like putting humanoid robots on display and trying to sell it to you and whatnot. I don't know how they will do as a business, but certainly there's less of that here, even in Silicon Valley. So it's because how visible it is and how people are genuinely not afraid of it. Whereas the attitude here is much more suspicious, then I think that like if you're a child and you wanted to interact with more AI, more robots,
Yeah.
China is
Yeah.
definitely the place to be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think interaction maybe is the most important thing for children. I know that in Silicon Valley there are actually lots of meetups, like tech people they talk about share ideas with each other. Maybe less facilities. You need a big place that you have lots of robots, interesting things that kids can play with. Maybe that's what is currently lacking in the Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I'm not as familiar with that community, but I can tell you that when we were in China, we have a large group, and some startups couldn't accommodate us, and their largest conference rooms don't hold so many people. And it was relatively easy for us to find like a AI co-working space or whatever that had a spare conference room that we could use. So that's something, by the way, I was really surprised. This is the shout out to the Shanghai Xuhui government, which is not honestly particularly known for tech, for those of you who are familiar with China. But about 10 years ago, they really started, and maybe earlier, but this is what I heard from one of the companies we visited. About a decade ago, they started really seriously investing in AI, which I think was quite prescient, right, at the time. And now, pretty much, at least for Shanghai, all the companies we visited were pretty much headquartered in that district, actually in a specific part of that district called Caojing. And I was just, like, really impressed at by the density and the way they've been able to reinvent themselves, right? Of course, they're also the hosts of the WAIC, and when it first started in 2018, I heard it was just, like, a very small event, and then eventually it got so big that they couldn't even hold it in their own district anymore. They have to go to Pudong where the, you know, like, the large venues are. I think next year they might have to switch to a larger venue because I think they pretty much are tapping out over there as well. Although I do have to say we were probably one of the largest foreign delegations there. I mean, we weren't
Oh,
an
okay.
official delegation, we just went as a group, but there weren't that many foreigners in at the conference, actually. And I would say, because I just answered this question for another reporter, so I've done some research, and I also verified with a bunch of AI contacts in China. Beijing is still the AI capital of China. It's more that Shanghai has surprised me in terms of how much AI it's done versus 10, 15 years ago with the mobile internet era. Shanghai is kind of an afterthought. Beijing was really like the epicenter. And now I just think that discrepancy is not as big, right? It's the same thing as in the US, you really have Silicon Valley dominating the conversation. But in China, you have multiple cities really competing to be a specific hub, right? Hangzhou, by the way, we went to visit, and we went to visit one of the municipal um, accelerators there, and they have a very well thought out plan about how they're going to incubate more AI businesses. And they're the home of DeepSeek. They're the home of Unitree. So they don't think they're, too far away from the lead either. So there are many cities in China with significant investments and deep talent.
Yeah, I think that's good for the general development of AI in China. And let's talk about challenges. What do you think Chinese AI companies still struggle with when it comes to global perception, talent, or expansion? You have just returned from seeing China's AI companies up close. How would you assess the real impact of US export, such as chips controls, on China's AI ecosystem?
Yeah, so we didn't really get into that, partly because a lot of the companies we're visiting are on the sort of more application level. They're not acquiring chips, right? They're just using a provider that already has it. I would say that based on what other people have shared very publicly, it does not seem to be that big of a problem in trying to acquire chips. So there are lots of resellers. I didn't see any of them at the conference, but I read from another report that at a certain section of the conference, there were people doing that, or there were vendors doing that, not individual people, but like actual companies. I didn't see that myself personally, but it just didn't really come up as a conversation topic. I think that what is much more problematic for the Chinese companies and what they find to be much more a headache is just the perception overall that they are untrustworthy because they are of Chinese origin, and that they will be partly just because of the national origin, but also because there have been Chinese companies that have been caught doing certain unethical practices or practices that were not up to global standards in terms of data privacy and security. And so they definitely feel like they have to fight against this perception and they have to do more. So you do see this new breed of companies who are much earlier acquiring all the certifications necessary, like, all the audits, and then putting in serious systems to ensure that they're compliant with all laws. They were much more adept at answering those questions, I think, than, the past generations of entrepreneurs, because they know this is a hyper focus area for their international clients. I would say that's a much bigger problem for these Chinese companies. That and what we said earlier about fundraising. So while I do agree with you, the fundraising is not as dire as many people make it out to be. I do think that, versus the US, like the Chinese fundraising environment is definitely not nearly as good. But, of course, very few people, very few ecosystems can beat Silicon Valley's like ability to stir up capital, right? So especially our risk appetite. So for Chinese companies, I think that those continue to be their bottlenecks, and far less so other things, at least for the companies that we talk to.
I see. And I know that you are now planning another trip coming back to China in September. Why another trip in just 2 months? And what can attendees expect from that trip?
Oh yeah, well, we were contacted by a group of investors, and then so they were already wanting to do this trip. So we still have a few openings, but it's a deep tech focused trip. We will touch much more lightly. This one was pretty deep into AI. This upcoming trip will be much more lightly into several different topics, which is AI, robotics, autonomous driving, electric vehicles, and EV tolls, which are the low altitude flights, so flying taxis. And I think those are what international investors are interested in seeing from China, honestly, which is, by the way, like quite surprising to me because if you think about it, like I said, the first part of TechBuzz's existence, the first 4 years, maybe five, were almost 100% focused on e-commerce and internet and social media like ByteDance, TikTok, live streaming, right? And now it's really we do half still that content and research, and we do half like emerging tech. EVs are something we've been writing about and researching for over 2 years now. Actually, we'll concurrently have an EV trip as well, end of September. But now it's really exciting to see there will be other technologies that could be, of interest to investors because for me, it's that makes it way less boring, right? As for why, social media, it's just because we had the interest, and at first, I was like, "Oh, I don't wanna do it so soon. I'm already very tired from this last one," which is, super intense, but I feel like if I didn't do it this year, then we probably have to wait until next year with all the holidays coming up. We don't work as hard in outside of China. I think by us, so there are going to be long gaps of seasonal holidays that I have to skip over. So in terms of 2025, this is kind of our main opening.
What about destinations in terms of cities? Are you going to visit some other cities other than Shanghai?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Shanghai will actually be a short stop, and we may even cut it out of the itinerary if some of the other meetings we're trying to pull through come through. So we're gonna do Beijing and Shenzhen this trip, and we may stop by Guangzhou and potentially Hefei. So it's only 5
Hefei is a good
days.
option.
Yeah, it's only
For only
5 days.
5 days.
Yeah, it's
Wow,
only
that's
5
very intensive schedule.
I know we'll be
Wow.
traveling every day or something like that. So
Wow.
yeah, we'll see. Or every yeah, almost every day. There'll be like four transportation swaps, but it'll be a
Wow.
good way for people to experience the high speed rail.
Mm.
And
Yeah, yeah.
we'll have to take some flights as well.
I think you also mentioned that journalists also welcome to join you. I think I'm not sure if when I publish our episode if the headcounts are still there, but if journalists want to cover this trip or if our listeners want to learn more details about this trip, where can they find about this? Follow you on Twitter or do
Yeah, you can go to techbuzzchina.com, the website. Yeah, we make, I would say this is not, so first of all, for the journalists who come, it's very, very specific, invite only. You have to be covering these types of companies. We make it very clear it's just for research purposes. You don't pay us. You're sort of just invited to tag along, and it is at the discretion of the companies. So they also have to say yes. It's very transparent to both sides. Yeah, we're not inviting journalists to come and cover the trip or anything like that. This is purely for learning, and it's purely because of the feedback we've gotten from because I know so many journalist friends who know about my trips and are like, "I would have really benefited from just tagging along and sort of being on a fly on the wall and seeing some of these companies up close," because, when many of the journalists are talking to these companies, something has already happened. And sometimes they don't have prior context. So I was like, oh, this is a great way for you to establish prior context. And yeah, it's sort of a very low stakes situation.
Got it, got it. And before we move to our final recommendation session, is there anything that I missed? Anything important you want to add on to this topic, or any special experience you want to share with us about your trip?
I guess what I would say is, many people ask me after the trip, like, "Hey, how's China doing on AI? Is Silicon Valley still leading?" And we're recording this podcast on the eve of, or the evening after OpenAI's released their GPT-5, right? So I would say that, in the short term, I do think absolutely Silicon Valley is still leading, but I think that's partly because people do have different priorities in China that they're looking at. There's just much more focus on embodied in AI. There is like more pressure to commercialize, right, for many, especially many of the smaller startups. And I think that the industries and the business realities look very different. We have like a really robust enterprise software ecosystem here in the US. AI is basically replacing, in my opinion, a lot of the old SaaS offerings, but there's a lot of willingness to spend a lot of fat IT budgets that does not necessarily exist in China or many of the other markets that Chinese companies are trying to go into. So they will result in different people using their energies differently, right? Like we said earlier, cost optimization is a huge thing, and that is a consideration, but not, the overwhelming consideration for many American companies. But I think overall it's really great to see, like, companies all over the world pushing ahead on AI. I think more and more going forward, there'll be sort of a co-evolution, right? Multiple players are going to learn from each other, and the iteration speed will just get faster and faster. I'm especially happy to see, OpenAI also doing more in open source. That was also something we asked a lot about, and I think for the foreseeable future, I don't think Chinese companies have any plans to change that strategy.
Yeah.
First of yeah, it is very much a strategy that the government really likes, that it makes sense as a business model for many of these Chinese companies, and as you said oh, sorry, as I said earlier, because of perceptions of trust, the more open they are, the more likely they're able to actually acquire, customers who might still be suspicious.
Yeah, I really like the opening up mindset behind like the open sourcing behind DeepSeek or ChatGPT. I think that's pretty important nowadays, giving like the bigger background of geopolitics or other things. But I think if you look at AI companies, I think DeepSeek at least set a good example for other companies in China, and because they succeed, so I think other companies are more likely to follow their way of doing this. So I think that's really inspiring. If we invite our every guest of our podcast to recommend something to our listeners, it can be a book, a movie, a TV series, a podcast, or even a video game, or anything you want to recommend. So, what do you want to recommend for our listeners today?
I'll just recommend the same book that I recommended in another podcast. I really should try to and it's called The Ministry for the Future. It's a sci-fi book. It's by this author called, Kim Stanley Robinson. It's climate fiction, and I think it's a pretty realistic, if dramatic, prediction of what might happen if climate change continues unabated. And just personally, we were in the middle of a typhoon when we were doing this trip in Shanghai and Hangzhou, and, like, I think 3 days into the trip, there was that horrific flash flood that killed 31 people in Beijing, and, of course, right before I left, there was that flash flood that killed over 100 people in Texas, right? So all these, like, very extreme climate events, and, of course, I live in a high wildfire risk region myself, so, like, I think all these high risk climate events are happening more frequently. And, I believe they are much more urgent to solve than any potential danger from AI. So maybe I'm the minority on that, but I think I
I
think
mean,
it yeah.
nowadays it's very hot. These days, these 2 days, are very hot in Beijing. I think people can definitely feel that. And the winter, the just past winter in Beijing, I think the length of the days that Beijing is in a winter mode is also even longer than the previous years. So the extreme weathers, no matter it's like coldness or like the very hot summer, it is happening. So I can really feel that. So yeah, I'll definitely check on that book. Thank you for your recommendation. And well, thank you so much for coming to my show. I mean, it's fantastic talk with you today. I learned a lot from you. And you mentioned you're going to visit Beijing maybe in September. I know you have a busy schedule, but if you have time, I'm very happy to meet you and to receive you at that moment.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I would love to visit.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you so much for listening to Inside the China Room. I really appreciate you staying with us till the end. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider following the show and leaving a quick rating or comment wherever you are listening. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners. I always love hearing from you as well, so feel free to email me at jjiang.sisu@hotmail.com with any thoughts, questions, or even ideas for future episodes. And if you found today's conversation helpful, please share the podcast with a friend who might enjoy it too. Thanks again for joining me. See you next time and take care.